The wooden pantry door slammed shut so hard that several jars rattled on their shelves. Abigail Harper froze. For one terrifying moment she thought the entire wall of preserves might come crashing down around her. Outside, wind howled against the ranch house like a living thing. Snow swirled through the darkness beyond the kitchen window, and somewhere in the distance, a horse screamed. The storm had arrived faster than anyone expected. Abigail gripped the edge of the work table as another gust shook the building. If the food stores failed, if the supplies didn't last, if the men working this ranch went hungry, every eye would turn to her, the outsider, the woman nobody wanted. And deep in her heart, Abigail feared they might already be waiting for her to fail. 3 weeks earlier, the world had looked very different. The stagecoach carrying Abigail Harper rolled slowly across the Montana prairie beneath a gray autumn sky. The journey from Minnesota had taken nearly 2 weeks, long enough for hope to grow, long enough for fear to grow beside it. Abigail sat quietly by the window, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The other passengers had spent most of the journey talking. She had spent most of it listening. That was something Abigail had learned years ago. People often revealed exactly what they thought when they believed she wasn't paying attention. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes they didn't bother whispering at all. Pretty face. Such a shame. If she lost half her weight, she'd have no trouble finding a husband. The words changed. The meaning never did. At 32 years old, Abigail had heard every version imaginable. She had learned to smile politely. She had learned to pretend it didn't hurt, but pretending was not the same thing as forgetting. As Red Willow Ranch came into view, Abigail felt her stomach tighten. A cluster of buildings stood against the vast Montana landscape. A large barn, several bunkhouses, corrals stretching toward distant hills, and beside the ranch gate stood a tall man waiting alone. Nathaniel Reed, the man who had agreed to marry her, the man she had never met. The stagecoach stopped. Dust swirled beneath the wheels. For a moment, neither moved. Nathaniel watched. Abigail gathered her courage. Then she stepped down. The disappointment crossed Nathaniel's face before he could hide it. Only a flicker, only a second, but Abigail saw it. She always saw it. Nathaniel felt immediate shame. The reaction had escaped him before he could stop it. He wasn't a cruel man. Most people in Montana would have called him fair and honorable. But he had spent months imagining the woman who would arrive. The reality before him was different from the picture in his mind. Not worse, just different. And he hated himself for noticing. Abigail offered a nervous smile. "Mr. Reed?" Nathaniel removed his hat. "Miss Harper, welcome to Red Willow." His voice was polite, his expression controlled, but neither of them felt at ease. The silence between them rode all the way back to the ranch. The arrival of a mail-order bride was ranch entertainment. By the time Nathaniel and Abigail reached the main house, several cowboys had already gathered nearby. Some pretended to work. Others made no effort to hide their curiosity. Caleb Morgan stood among them. As trail boss, he considered it his responsibility to judge everything and everyone. His eyes swept over Abigail. A grin appeared. Not kind, not entirely cruel either, just dismissive. "So that's the bride." Several men laughed quietly. Nathaniel shot Caleb a warning look. The laughter stopped, but Abigail had already heard enough. Samuel Boone, the oldest ranch hand, watched the scene from the porch. Unlike the others, he noticed the sadness behind Abigail's smile. Samuel had buried a wife 20 years earlier. He recognized loneliness when he saw it. Young Mateo Cruz noticed it too. He felt sorry for her immediately. Nobody deserved to be greeted that way, especially not after traveling halfway across the country. The first few days passed awkwardly. Abigail tried to find her place. Nathaniel tried to be courteous. Neither knew how to bridge the distance between them. The ranch house itself needed attention, the kitchen especially. Years of neglect showed everywhere. Cabinets were disorganized, supplies were scattered, records were incomplete. Abigail quietly began cleaning, sorting, planning, observing. No one paid much attention, at first. What surprised her most was how many men Red Willow fed. Cowboys drifted in and out constantly. Workers from neighboring ranches occasionally stayed overnight. Hungry men appeared at every meal. Keeping them fed required far more organization than anyone realized. Abigail understood immediately. The kitchen wasn't just a room, it was the heart of the ranch. If the kitchen failed, everything else eventually failed too. 4 days after her arrival, Abigail prepared her first full supper. The dining hall filled quickly. Conversations echoed across the room. Many of the cowboys arrived expecting disappointment. A few seemed almost eager for it. Caleb took a seat near the front. "If the biscuits can break teeth, we'll know who made them." Several men chuckled. Abigail heard him. She kept working. The meal was simple: beef stew, fresh biscuits, corn pudding, apple preserves. Nothing fancy. Just honest food. The first few bites silenced the room. Then came second helpings, then thirds. Even Caleb cleaned his plate, though he refused to admit why. Across the room, Nathaniel watched quietly. The food reminded him of meals his mother used to make. Warm, comforting, home. For the first time since Abigail's arrival, he felt something unexpected: respect. That evening, Abigail washed dishes long after everyone else had gone to bed. She was tired, but it was the satisfying kind of tired. Maybe things would improve. Maybe she could belong here after all. Then voices drifted through the open window. Cowboys talking outside. She recognized Caleb immediately. "That woman isn't a bride." Laughter followed. "She's kitchen help, that's all." The words struck harder than Abigail expected. Silence filled the room. The warm hope she had carried all evening slowly faded. Upstairs, Nathaniel sat alone in his office reviewing ranch accounts. He never heard the conversation. Had he heard it, he would have stopped it. But some hurts arrive quietly, without witnesses, without defenders. Late that night, Abigail sat alone beside her bedroom window. Moonlight covered the prairie. The ranch slept peacefully below. She thought about leaving. She truly did. No contract could force her to stay. No promise required her to endure humiliation. Yet something kept her there. Perhaps stubbornness. Perhaps hope. Perhaps the simple desire to prove that she was more than the size people saw. Eventually, she climbed into bed. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. The next morning, Nathaniel found her reviewing inventory records in the kitchen. Stacks of notes covered the table. Numbers filled several pages. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." Abigail nodded. "There may be a problem." Nathaniel pulled up a chair. She explained what she had discovered: food shortages, poor inventory management, waste, missing supplies. As Nathaniel listened, concern replaced surprise. She was right, every word. Finally, he leaned back. "Can you cook for 40 hungry cowboys all winter?" The question hung between them. Abigail glanced toward the pantry, toward the shelves, toward the responsibility already resting on her shoulders. Then she looked back at him. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I can." Nathaniel nodded. But as he walked away, neither of them noticed the first dark clouds gathering over the distant Montana mountains. Winter was coming sooner than anyone expected, and before long, Red Willow Ranch would need Abigail Harper far more than it knew. The dark clouds that Nathaniel Reed and Abigail Harper had barely noticed a week earlier settled over Montana like a warning. Winter was arriving ahead of schedule. Nobody at Red Willow Ranch liked that fact. Winter meant isolation. Winter meant uncertainty. Most of all, winter meant survival. The morning after Nathaniel asked whether she could feed 40 cowboys through the season, Abigail stood alone inside the pantry with a ledger in one hand and a lantern in the other. The numbers troubled her. She counted flour sacks. She counted beans. She counted preserved vegetables. Then she counted them again. The inventory records claimed the ranch possessed enough food to last nearly 4 months. The shelves told a different story. Someone had been careless. Perhaps several people, for years. Abigail sighed and wrote another note in the margin of her ledger. When she worked at logging camps in Minnesota, mistakes like these could become deadly. Hungry workers made poor decisions. Poor decisions led to accidents, and accidents often led to funerals. She had no intention of allowing Red Willow Ranch to learn that lesson the hard way. The ranch woke before sunrise. Men moved through the cold darkness carrying tools and lanterns. Coffee simmered on the stove. Horses stomped inside the barn. Life at Red Willow followed routines older than most of the men working there. Abigail watched them from the kitchen window. Nathaniel was already outside. The ranch owner seemed to belong to the landscape itself, tall, quiet, steady. The kind of man who spoke little and expected others to do the same. Many people respected him. Some feared disappointing him. Few truly knew him. Even Nathaniel sometimes wondered whether he knew himself anymore, especially since Abigail's arrival. Every day he discovered another reason his first impression had been unfair. And every day that realization made him increasingly uncomfortable. By the end of her second week, Abigail had transformed the kitchen. Shelves were labeled, supplies were organized, waste was reduced. The pantry finally made sense. The changes did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, Mateo Cruz entered carrying 2 crates of potatoes. He stopped in the doorway and stared around the room. "Looks different every time I come in here," Abigail laughed softly. "Different good or different bad? Good." He set down the crates. "Actually, it looks like somebody knows what they're doing." Abigail smiled. Compliments still surprised her. For most of her life, people had noticed her appearance before they noticed anything else. Mateo noticed effort. That meant more than he realized. As the days passed, Mateo found more reasons to help in the kitchen. Sometimes he carried supplies. Sometimes he repaired shelves. Sometimes he simply lingered to talk. Abigail learned that his mother had raised 5 children after losing her husband. She learned that money had often been scarce. She learned that people had underestimated his mother as often as they underestimated Abigail. "My mother used to say something," Mateo told her one afternoon. "What was that?" "People see what they're looking for." Abigail paused. "Meaning, if they're looking for weakness, they'll find it. If they're looking for strength, they'll find that too." Abigail thought about those words long after Mateo returned to work. Not everyone shared Mateo's perspective. Caleb Morgan remained openly skeptical. One evening, he walked into the dining hall while Abigail was preparing supper. He glanced around the room, then at the kitchen, then at Abigail. "Funny." Abigail continued kneading bread dough. "The men seem happier lately." A few nearby cowboys exchanged nervous glances. They knew Caleb's reputation. He rarely complimented anyone. "That's good, isn't it?" Abigail asked. Caleb shrugged. "We'll see how happy they are when winter gets serious." The room fell quiet. His meaning was clear. A few successful meals proved nothing. The real test still lay ahead. After Caleb left, Abigail pretended his words didn't bother her, but they did, because part of her feared he might be right. The weather grew colder. The first hard freeze arrived in early November. Frost-coated fences, water troughs iced over. The mountains disappeared behind low gray clouds. One morning, Samuel Boone entered the kitchen before dawn. The old ranch hand carried firewood in his arms. Without speaking, he placed several logs beside the stove. Abigail smiled. "You know there are younger men for that." Samuel smiled back. "They're all too busy thinking they're important." Abigail laughed. Samuel rarely joked. That made it funnier when he did. As he turned to leave, his eyes lingered on the nearly empty breakfast plate beside her. "You eating enough?" Abigail blinked. The question caught her off guard. "I'm fine." Samuel grunted. The sound clearly meant he didn't believe her. The next morning, she discovered an extra biscuit, 2 slices of ham, and an apple sitting beside her workstation. No note, no explanation. She knew exactly who had left them. The gesture warmed her more than the stove ever could. 3 days later, disaster arrived. A freight wagon carrying winter supplies failed to appear. At first, nobody worried. Delays happened. Roads were rough. Distances were long. But by the second day, concern spread. By the third, Nathaniel rode into town himself. He returned after dark. The expression on his face told the story before he spoke. The shipment wasn't coming. A bridge had collapsed north of town. Several supply wagons had overturned. Some cargo was lost entirely. The rest might not arrive for weeks, perhaps longer. Silence settled over the dining hall. Every man understood the implications. Winter was only beginning. That night, Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table, reviewing numbers with Abigail. The lantern between them cast long shadows across the room. "How bad is it?" he asked. Abigail studied her notes. "Worse than I'd like." Nathaniel nodded. He appreciated honesty. "Can we make it?" Abigail hesitated. Every eye in the ranch seemed to rest on her answer. Finally, she said, "Yes." Nathaniel looked up. "You're certain?" "No." The honesty surprised him. "But I know we have a chance." That answer somehow reassured him more than false confidence ever could. The next morning, Abigail began ration planning. She adjusted recipes, reduced waste further, created entirely new meal schedules. Every ingredient had a purpose. Every portion had a reason. Nothing was wasted. Some men expected complaints. Instead, the meals remained surprisingly good. Stews became heartier. Bread became more frequent. Vegetables were stretched creatively. Nobody went hungry. In fact, most of the ranch never realized how serious the situation truly was. Nathaniel noticed. More importantly, he noticed Abigail, not her appearance, not her size, the woman herself. He noticed how she woke before everyone else, how she worked after everyone slept, how she quietly checked on sick workers, how she listened when others spoke, how she never complained. One evening, he paused outside the kitchen doorway. Abigail stood at the work table reviewing inventory. A loose strand of hair had escaped her braid. Flour dusted her sleeves. She looked tired, very tired, yet she continued working. Nathaniel found himself staring, not because he intended to, because he suddenly realized how much responsibility she carried, responsibility he had placed upon her shoulders. Abigail sensed someone watching and looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nathaniel awkwardly cleared his throat. "Everything all right?" "Yes." A brief silence followed. "Good." He immediately felt foolish. It was hardly a conversation, but it was the first time in weeks they had spoken without tension. When he left, Abigail watched him go. She couldn't understand him. One day he seemed distant, the next thoughtful. Part of her wondered whether he regretted bringing her to Montana. Another part wondered whether he was beginning to change his mind. Several days later, Samuel sat beside Nathaniel outside the barn. Snow drifted gently across the prairie. The ranch appeared peaceful, but both men knew difficult months lay ahead. Samuel watched workers crossing the yard. Then he spoke. "That woman has already saved this place." Nathaniel followed his gaze toward the ranch house. Abigail was visible through the kitchen window, moving from stove to pantry, working as always. "Maybe," Nathaniel admitted. Samuel shook his head. "No, not maybe." Nathaniel remained silent, because deep down, he knew the old man was right. Far above the ranch, hidden beyond the mountains, another storm was already forming. And before winter ended, Red Willow Ranch would face challenges far greater than missing supplies. Challenges that would test every person on the ranch, most of all, Abigail Harper. Snow arrived during the night, not the gentle kind that drifted lazily from the sky. This snow came with teeth. By dawn, Red Willow Ranch lay beneath a blanket of white so thick that fences had nearly disappeared. The world beyond the ranch house looked smaller, colder, more dangerous. Abigail Harper stood at the kitchen window watching the storm build. Something about it unsettled her. Years of working in logging camps had taught her to trust certain instincts. This storm was not finished, not even close. Behind her, breakfast was already underway. Cowboys crowded the dining hall. Coffee cups clinked. Boots scraped wooden floors. The familiar sounds normally comforted her. Today, they didn't. Nathaniel entered carrying a folded piece of paper. Snow dusted his shoulders. His expression immediately drew attention. Conversations quieted. "What happened?" Samuel asked. Nathaniel unfolded the note. Message came from Bear Creek. The room grew still. "The trail crew is coming home." Several men smiled. Others nodded with relief. A cattle drive meant weeks away from home, weeks of sleeping outdoors, weeks of hard weather. Returning safely was always worth celebrating. Then Nathaniel continued, "They'll be here within 4 days." Abigail's mind instantly began calculating. 18 additional cowboys, perhaps more. Combined with the men already at Red Willow, nearly 45 mouths would need feeding. The timing could not have been worse. Outside, the storm intensified. Nathaniel spent most of that day preparing the ranch. Extra stalls were cleaned. Equipment was secured. Workers reinforced doors and windows. Everyone understood what was coming. Montana winters demanded respect. Ignoring them often carried consequences. Meanwhile, Abigail retreated to the pantry. She closed the door and examined every shelf, every barrel, every sack, every remaining crate. The numbers weren't good, not disastrous, not yet, but close enough to worry her. She ran her fingers through a nearly empty sack of flour. Less than she hoped, more than she feared, somewhere in the middle. The most dangerous place of all, because uncertainty made planning difficult, and winter rarely rewarded uncertainty. By evening, snow covered the ranch yard completely. The wind screamed across the prairie. Several younger cowboys attempted to laugh it off. The older men knew better. Samuel Boone sat beside the stove. His weathered eyes studied the windows. "Feels wrong," he muttered. Mateo looked up. "What does the storm?" The younger cowboy smiled. "It's snow." Samuel shook his head. "No." His gaze moved toward the darkness outside. "It's something worse." Nobody argued. Because everyone trusted Samuel's instincts. He had survived enough winters to recognize trouble before it arrived. The next morning proved him right. The blizzard hit. Wind struck the ranch house with such force that dishes rattled inside cabinets. Snow poured sideways across the landscape. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Nathaniel ordered everyone indoors except for essential livestock crews. Even those men remained outside only briefly. The storm seemed determined to bury the entire territory. Abigail worked continuously. Breakfast became lunch. Lunch became supper. The kitchen stove burned day and night. She barely noticed time passing. But she noticed the growing concern on every face, most of all, Nathaniel's. Late that afternoon, another problem emerged. A section of the barn roof partially collapsed beneath the weight of snow. Fortunately, nobody was injured, but several hours were lost making repairs. The ranch's already strained resources stretched further. Nathaniel spent the evening reviewing supplies again. The conclusions remained troubling. When he finally entered the kitchen after dark, Abigail was still working. Several ledgers lay open on the table. She looked exhausted. Nathaniel pulled out a chair. "How bad is it?" Abigail didn't answer immediately. She studied her numbers one final time. "Not good." Nathaniel nodded. He appreciated honesty. "The trail crew, we can feed them." Nathaniel waited. The hesitation concerned him. "For how long?" Abigail looked up. "If the storm continues." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Both understood. The following morning brought no improvement. Snow continued falling, wind continued howling, and the expected arrival date of the returning cowboys drew closer. Pressure settled over Abigail like an extra weight she couldn't put down. Every meal mattered. Every decision mattered. Every ounce of food mattered. She barely slept. When she did sleep, she dreamed about empty shelves, hungry men, failure, the same fear she had carried most of her life. The fear that eventually everyone would discover she wasn't enough. By the third day of the storm, Caleb Morgan finally voiced what several others had been thinking. The confrontation happened inside the dining hall. A handful of cowboys were eating lunch. Abigail was serving stew. Nathaniel stood nearby discussing livestock losses. Caleb set down his spoon. "This isn't going to work." Silence followed. Nathaniel frowned. "What isn't?" Caleb gestured toward the storm outside. "The food situation." Nobody spoke. Caleb continued. 45 men. His eyes shifted toward Abigail. "A blizzard." Then he shrugged. "No woman could pull this off." The room became painfully quiet. Several cowboys looked uncomfortable. Mateo stared at his plate. Samuel's jaw tightened. Nathaniel immediately opened his mouth to respond, but Abigail had already heard enough. She quietly turned away and returned to the kitchen. For several minutes she worked without thinking, without feeling, without breathing properly. She sliced vegetables, stirred soup, measured flour, performed familiar tasks automatically. Then, suddenly, she couldn't anymore. The knife slipped from her fingers. It clattered onto the table. The sound echoed through the empty kitchen. And finally, the tears came. Not because of Caleb, not entirely, because Caleb's words had awakened every old wound, every rejection, every disappointment, every cruel remark she'd spent years pretending didn't matter. She gripped the edge of the work table. Her shoulders shook. For the first time since arriving at Red Willow Ranch, she truly considered giving up. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she never had. The thought lingered, heavy, painful, tempting. Then the kitchen door opened. Samuel Boone stepped inside. He immediately understood. Old men who had buried wives and buried dreams often recognized heartbreak without explanation. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Samuel walked over and picked up the fallen knife. He placed it back on the table. Then he looked directly at Abigail. "You know what I think?" She wiped her eyes. "What?" Samuel shrugged. "I think people like us don't quit." Abigail stared at him. People like us, not heroes, not beautiful people, not important people, just ordinary people who kept going, no matter what. Something inside her steadied, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. The next morning, the storm finally began to weaken. Not end, but weaken. And shortly before sunset, a lookout spotted riders approaching from the north, the trail crew. They were coming home. The men arrived frozen, exhausted, covered in snow and ice. Their horses looked nearly as tired as they did. Abigail immediately went to work. The kitchen exploded into activity. Mateo hauled firewood. Several ranch hands carried water. Everyone followed Abigail's instructions. For hours she worked without stopping. Bread baked in the ovens. Stew simmered in massive pots. Coffee filled the air with rich aroma. Apple cakes browned slowly beside the stove. Every remaining ingredient seemed to transform beneath her hands. As darkness settled outside, the dining hall filled. 45 hungry cowboys crowded the room. Conversation faded as plates arrived. Then something remarkable happened. Silence. Not the silence of disappointment, the silence of gratitude. Men who had spent weeks battling snow and loneliness suddenly found warmth, comfort, home. Several stared at their meals as though they could hardly believe them. Others closed their eyes after the first bite. Nathaniel watched from across the room. He watched Abigail carry plates to everyone before serving herself. He watched her smile despite exhaustion. And for the first time, shame settled heavily inside him. Because he remembered the woman who stepped off the stagecoach weeks earlier, and he remembered how quickly he had judged her. The meal lasted long into the evening. Stories filled the hall. Laughter returned. Hope returned. The storm outside no longer seemed quite so frightening. Then, near the end of supper, an elderly cowboy slowly lowered his coffee cup. Walter Pierce, 68 years old, weathered by decades of hard living. His eyes remained fixed on Abigail. The longer he stared, the paler he became. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. One emotion after another crossed his face. Finally, he rose from his chair. The room gradually quieted. Walter took a slow step forward, then another. Never taking his eyes off Abigail, his voice emerged little more than a whisper. "That can't be possible." Abigail looked puzzled. The room fell silent. Walter swallowed hard. Then he spoke again. This time everyone heard him. "I know you." And suddenly every eye in Red Willow Ranch turned toward Abigail Harper. The dining hall remained silent long after Walter Pierce spoke. 45 cowboys sat frozen in place. Even the crackling stove seemed quieter. Abigail Harper stared at the elderly man across the room, struggling to understand his reaction. She had never seen him before. At least she didn't think she had. Walter took another slow step forward. His weathered face had lost all color. "I know you," he repeated. The room waited. Abigail set down the serving spoon she was holding. "I think you're mistaken." Walter shook his head. "No." His voice trembled. "I'd know those eyes anywhere." Nathaniel looked from Walter to Abigail. "What are you talking about?" Walter swallowed hard. Then he asked a question. "Did you ever work at Pine River Logging Camp in Minnesota?" The color drained from Abigail's face. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, she nodded. "Many years ago." Walter closed his eyes. A deep breath escaped him. When he opened them again, they were filled with emotion. "My God." The words barely left his lips. "It really is you." Nobody left the dining hall that night. The storm still raged outside. But inside, every person wanted to hear what Walter had to say. The old cowboy slowly lowered himself into a chair. For a few moments, he simply stared into the fire, as though he were looking back through time, back to another winter, another life. Finally, he began. 20 years ago, Pine River was one of the largest logging camps in Minnesota. Several of the older cowboys nodded. They had heard of it. Walter continued. There were hundreds of workers. His eyes shifted toward Abigail. Then sickness came. The room grew quiet again. Everyone understood what sickness meant in isolated places. Fear, death, abandonment. Walter's voice softened. Men started getting fevers. Coughing. Too weak to stand. Too weak to work. He paused. Too weak to survive. Abigail lowered her gaze. The memories were returning. Memories she had spent years trying not to revisit. Walter continued. The camp owners panicked. Some supervisors left. Some workers ran. People were afraid. His eyes filled with tears. And honestly, I don't blame them. Nobody interrupted. Walter looked directly at Nathaniel. I was one of the sick men. The admission surprised everyone, including Nathaniel. We thought we were going to die. We truly did. The old cowboy's voice cracked. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough medicine. Most people stopped coming near us. The room fell completely silent. Then Walter pointed toward Abigail. Except her. Abigail closed her eyes. She wished he would stop. Not because the story was untrue, because she had never considered herself extraordinary. She had only done what she thought was necessary. Walter continued anyway. She stayed. Every day. Every night. When everyone else was leaving, she stayed. The old man's hands trembled. She cooked for us. Cleaned our cabins. Carried water. Changed bandages. sat beside dying men so they wouldn't be alone. Several cowboys exchanged looks. The image was difficult to imagine. The quiet woman they knew from the kitchen suddenly seemed much larger than life. Walter shook his head. You don't understand. There were over 100 sick workers. Over 100. And she never stopped. Nathaniel glanced toward Abigail. For the first time, he saw genuine discomfort on her face. Not pride, not satisfaction, discomfort, as though she wanted none of the attention. That realization affected him more than Walter's story. People who sought admiration behaved differently. Abigail looked like someone who wished the floor would swallow her whole. Walter leaned forwards. There was one night I'll never forget. The room listened. The fever nearly killed me. I remember waking up. I couldn't move. I couldn't even lift my head. His voice became softer. But she was there. He looked at Abigail. You sat beside my bed. You spoon-fed me broth. You stayed until morning. Tears filled his eyes. You saved my life. No one spoke. Several cowboys looked away. Others stared into their coffee cups. The room suddenly felt warmer and far more emotional. Finally, Abigail stood, her hands folded nervously in front of her. That's enough, Walter. The old cowboy looked up. She smiled gently. You make it sound like I was brave. Walter frowned. You were. Abigail shook her head. No. Her voice was calm, honest. I was terrified. The room grew quiet again. Every eye turned toward her. Abigail took a slow breath, then she spoke. For months I couldn't sleep. I cried almost every night. I wanted to leave. A few cowboys looked surprised. Abigail continued. I wanted to run, just like everyone else. The admission shocked the room, because heroes weren't supposed to feel fear, but Abigail wasn't describing a hero. She was describing a human being. I stayed because people needed help. She paused. Not because I was fearless. The words settled deeply into every heart present, including Nathaniel's, especially Nathaniel's. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then a chair scraped across the floor. Caleb Morgan stood. The entire room turned toward him. Abigail's stomach tightened. She expected another criticism, another challenge. Instead, Caleb removed his hat, something he almost never did indoors. He looked directly at her, then lowered his head. I owe you an apology. The room froze. Nobody could remember Caleb apologizing to anyone, ever. His voice was rough, honest. I judged you. The words came slowly. From the first day. He shook his head. And I was wrong. Abigail stared at him. The room stared at him. Caleb swallowed. You've worked harder than anyone here. His eyes briefly moved across the dining hall. You've probably saved this ranch too. Then he looked back at Abigail. I'm sorry. Silence followed. Then Samuel Boone nodded. Several cowboys followed, then more. One by one, the respect Abigail had earned finally became visible. Not through words, through actions. That night, the dining hall emptied slowly. Cowboys drifted toward bunkhouses. The storm weakened outside. The ranch finally settled into quiet. Abigail remained behind to clean the kitchen. She preferred working alone when her emotions felt overwhelming. The familiar routine helped. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, organizing supplies, simple tasks, predictable tasks, safe tasks. She was stacking plates when footsteps approached. She didn't need to look up. She already knew who it was, Nathaniel Reed. For several moments neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, just uncertain. Nathaniel removed his hat and placed it on the table. Then he looked directly at her. When you stepped off that stagecoach, Abigail stopped working. The words immediately captured her attention. Nathaniel took a slow breath. I saw your size before I saw you. The honesty struck harder than any apology, because she already knew it was true. He continued, and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. Abigail felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain, from relief. At last someone had spoken the truth aloud. No pretending, no excuses, just honesty. Nathaniel's voice softened. I was wrong about you. He shook his head. No, that's not right. I didn't know you at all. The kitchen fell silent. The only sound came from the crackling stove. Then Nathaniel stepped closer. And now I do. Winter gradually loosened its grip on Montana. Weeks passed, snow melted, roads reopened, supply wagons returned. The ranch survived, more than survived. It prospered. The difficult season brought people together in ways none of them expected. Abigail became part of Red Willow Ranch, not an outsider, not a temporary guest, part of the family. Cowboys sought her advice, neighbors respected her. Even Caleb occasionally stopped by the kitchen simply to ask how her day was going. Something nobody would have believed a few months earlier. Spring arrived quietly. Wildflowers appeared across the hills. The prairie turned green again. One afternoon, Nathaniel asked Abigail to take a walk with him. They climbed a ridge overlooking the ranch. Below them stood the buildings that had witnessed an entire season of change. The barn, the corrals, the ranch house, home, for both of them. Nathaniel stopped walking. For a moment he simply admired the view. Then he turned toward her. His expression carried none of the uncertainty she had seen months earlier. Only sincerity. Only certainty. Abigail Harper. She smiled. Yes. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket, then slowly dropped to one knee. Abigail's eyes widened. I think my first proposal was terrible. A laugh escaped her. Terrible is a fair description. Nathaniel smiled, then his voice softened. This one matters. The wind moved gently through the grass around them. I don't want to cook. I don't want a housekeeper. I don't want someone to solve my problems. His eyes never left hers. I want you. Tears filled Abigail's eyes, not because she had finally been chosen, because she had finally been seen for who she truly was, not her size, not her appearance, her. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough, more than enough. As the spring sun settled over Red Willow Ranch, Abigail Harper said yes. And the woman who had spent years believing she was too much for everyone finally discovered the truth. She had never been too much. She had simply been waiting for the place and the people who could see the extraordinary heart she carried all along.